Imagine a world without pandemics, not the sniffly cold or seasonal flu, but the terrifying, world-changing kind. Let's step into the medieval era, where people lived crammed into filthy cities with no sanitation, no germ theory, and absolutely no hope against invisible killers. Now picture this: the Black Death, a plague so deadly it wiped out nearly half of Europe's population in just 4 years. Cities emptied, fields were abandoned, and the stench of death filled the air. But what if it never happened? What if this catastrophic event that redefined human history just didn't exist? Before we dive into this alternate scenario, let's rewind a bit and set the stage for what actually happened. What was the Black Death? In the 14th century, Europe was no stranger to plagues, but nothing could prepare them for what was coming. The Black Death wasn't just a minor outbreak. It was a cataclysmic event that killed between 25 and 30 million people in just 4 years. That's nearly half of Europe's population wiped out in the blink of an eye. So how did this horrific plague spread? The disease originated in Central Asia, carried by fleas that lived on rats. These fleas hopped aboard merchant ships, and with the revived trade routes set up by the Mongol Empire, the plague began its deadly journey across Asia and Europe. By the time it reached Europe, it was like throwing gasoline on an already explosive fire. The densely populated cities, with their poor sanitation and cramped living conditions, became the perfect breeding grounds for the plague. Symptoms were absolutely gruesome. Victims would develop painful boils, or buboes the size of an apple, that would burst open and ooze pus. They'd vomit blood, suffer from dizziness, and die within days. The fear was unlike anything ever seen before. No one knew where it came from, and, more importantly, no one knew how to stop it. The streets were filled with the bodies of the dead, and soon people began to panic, blaming anyone they could think of. The spread of the plague. The Black Death didn't just hit one country, it tore across Asia, the Middle East, and Europe. The Mongols, who had already conquered large parts of Asia, unintentionally spread the plague further. While besieging the Crimean city of Kaffa, the Mongols used an early form of biological warfare by launching plague-infected bodies into the city. It wasn't long before the disease spread to Italy, carried by fleeing merchants. In Europe, cities with dense populations like Florence, Venice, and London became epicenters of the plague. The disease spread quickly through crowded streets where hygiene was non-existent and death was a daily companion. The rate of infection was horrifying. By the end of 1347, nearly half of Europe's population had perished, leaving a continent in mourning and in chaos. But here's the thing: the Black Death wasn't just devastating because it killed so many people. It caused massive shifts in every aspect of society. Social structures, economies, religious beliefs, and even politics were all dramatically altered. The Black Death changed the course of human history in ways we still feel today. The social and economic impact. Let's talk about how this sudden loss of life reshaped European society. With so many dead, labor became scarce. Farmers, artisans, and workers were in short supply, which meant that those who survived had more bargaining power. This led to higher wages and better living conditions for many peasants, a rare shift in the feudal system. Before the plague, Europe's feudal system had kept people locked in place. Nobles had power, peasants worked the land, and there was very little social mobility. But after the plague, things started to change. With fewer workers, peasants demanded higher wages, which led to revolts in some areas. The economic structure of Europe began to crumble as the old ways could no longer support the new realities. Without the plague, however, the social structure would have remained much more rigid. The overpopulation issues Europe faced before the plague would have continued, and the economy would have struggled to keep up with the demand for food, resources, and land. Feudalism would have been much harder to break, and political revolutions would have been delayed. The church and religion. Another crucial aspect to consider is the role of religion. The Black Death had a massive impact on people's faith in the church. As half of the clergy were wiped out, many began to question the authority of the church and its teachings. How could God let such suffering happen? Was the church powerless to stop it? This led to a gradual decline in the church's influence over people's lives. Fast forward a few hundred years, and you see the Protestant Reformation, a movement that would never have gained the same momentum if the Black Death hadn't shaken the foundations of European Christianity. Without this early questioning of faith, intellectual movements like the Renaissance or the Enlightenment might have been delayed too. After all, it was during times of crisis, like the Black Death, that people began to look for answers beyond traditional religious explanations. Technology and innovation. One of the most significant long-term effects of the Black Death was its role in pushing Europe toward innovation. With fewer workers, those who remained had to find new ways of doing things. The labor shortage pushed the need for technological advancements in agriculture and industry. This meant that inventions like the printing press and advances in farming technology were developed much sooner. Without the plague, this pressure wouldn't have existed. There would have been less incentive to innovate. The population would have continued to grow, and the technological revolution that spurred the Renaissance could have been delayed for centuries. Europe would remain trapped in a medieval mindset, unable to progress toward the modern world as quickly. The long-term effects. A stagnated future? So what happens when you remove the Black Death from the equation? Let's be clear. Life in this alternate timeline wouldn't be easier or more pleasant. Sure, fewer people would have died, but the problems caused by overpopulation, like famine, resource scarcity, and widespread poverty, would have persisted. Without the plague, Europe's population would have continued to grow unchecked, leading to even more food shortages and social unrest. The labor market would have remained flooded with workers, and wages would have stayed low, trapping the lower classes in poverty. Feudalism, though eroded in our timeline, would have likely remained intact for much longer. Social mobility would have been harder to achieve, and the economic landscape would have stagnated. On the political front, without the Black Death, Europe would have remained more fragmented and less centralized. The Renaissance, the age of exploration, and the eventual rise of capitalism might have been delayed, meaning modern Europe could have looked entirely different. So, what if the Black Death had never happened? It's easy to imagine a world with fewer deaths, but the reality is that Europe was already struggling with famine, overcrowding, and unrest. The plague didn't just kill, it cleared the path for a new order. Without it, Europe's rise to the modern world would have been slower and harder, delaying technological, social, and cultural shifts. History has a way of forcing change when we least expect it. So what do you think? Would a world without the Black Death be better or worse? Let me know in the comments below.